When I first heard about the Red Room, I thought it was just another urban legend, the kind of thing whispered about at college parties or shared in grainy Reddit threads. But legends, like rumors, usually come from a seed of truth, and this one had roots deep enough to pull people under. It started with a call from my cousin, Dana. She was frantic, her words tumbling over each other like loose gravel. "You're good at finding people, right? You're like a journalist or whatever." "Freelance writer," I corrected. She ignored me. "Then you have to help me find Ryan." Ryan was her boyfriend. Well, technically her ex, though they never seemed to stay broken up for long. He'd been missing for 3 days, and the cops weren't taking it seriously. The last thing he sent me, Dana said, was a text. It just said, "I found the Red Room," then nothing. The Red Room wasn't a place, at least not in the traditional sense. It was supposedly an online experience, hidden deep in the dark web. Stories about it varied. Some said it was a live stream of people confessing their darkest secrets. Others claimed it was a pay-per-view for the kind of horrors you can't unsee. But all the stories agreed on one thing. Once you found the Red Room, you never came back the same. Dana handed me Ryan's laptop, and I started digging. His browsing history was a mess of conspiracy forums and encrypted chat rooms. It didn't take long to find his last search. How to access the Red Room. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. Dead links led to dead ends, which led to forums filled with cryptic warnings. Curiosity kills. The Red Room isn't a place, it's a choice. And then, late one night, I found it. A single message popped up on my screen. "Do you want to enter?" Clicking that message felt like stepping off a cliff. My screen went black, and for a long moment, I thought I'd bricked the laptop. Then a video feed flickered to life. The camera panned over a dimly lit room, its walls painted a deep, glossy red. In the center was a chair, bolted to the floor, with thick leather straps dangling from its arms. The room was empty, but the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. A distorted voice crackled through my speakers. "Welcome, Caleb." I froze. I hadn't entered my name anywhere. "You're looking for Ryan," the voice continued. "He was here. Would you like to see what he left behind?" The screen shifted, showing a table in the corner of the room. On it was a notebook, its cover splattered with something dark. The feed cut out. I didn't know how, but they'd sent it to me. The notebook arrived the next morning in a plain brown envelope. No return address. The pages were filled with Ryan's handwriting, at first frantic and messy, then devolving into illegible scrawls. The early entries described the Red Room as a test. Each visitor was given a choice: to watch, to participate, or to leave. "Leaving isn't what you think," one entry read. "It doesn't mean going back. It means becoming part of it." The later entries were worse. Ryan wrote about the things he'd seen, people confessing to crimes that made my skin crawl, others begging for forgiveness as shadowy figures loomed behind them. "The Red Room knows you," Ryan wrote. "It sees you. And once it does, it doesn't let go." The final entry stopped me cold. "It's here. It's in the walls. I can feel it watching me." That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was static from my old radio, but when I turned it off, the sound persisted, faint voices just behind my ears, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Then came the knocking. It started at 3:13 a.m., soft but insistent, like a neighbor wanting to borrow sugar. I opened the door to find nothing but the empty street. The next night, the knocking came again, this time louder, more demanding. When I refused to answer, the whispers grew sharper, closer, like they were burrowing into my skull. And then, on the third night, the door opened on its own. The Red Room wasn't just online. It was here, in my apartment, infecting the air, seeping into the cracks of my mind. A chair appeared in the corner of my living room, identical to the one I'd seen on the video feed. Beside it, a small table held a knife and a single sheet of paper. The paper had 2 words scrawled on it: confess, choose. The whispers grew deafening, and the room seemed to tilt. Memories I'd buried clawed their way to the surface. The lies I'd told, the people I'd hurt, the secrets I'd kept even from myself. I understood then that the Red Room wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, a trap designed to strip you bare and force you to confront the worst parts of yourself. And once it had you, there was no escape. They found Ryan's body 3 weeks later, miles away from Glass Lake, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. As for me, I'm writing this from a motel room far from home. The whispers haven't stopped, and the chair is always there, waiting in the corner. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. The Red Room is real, and it's always watching. So tell me, when it finds you, what will you choose? Some places don't show up on maps for a reason. I learned that the hard way when I took a wrong turn on a road trip through upstate New York. I was on my way to visit my brother, the highway stretching endlessly under a gray October sky. I missed an exit while fiddling with the radio, and my GPS decided to take me on a scenic route. That's how I ended up in Gray Town, or at least, that's what the faded sign at the edge of the road called it. The place didn't look like much. A few abandoned houses, a gas station with a crooked sign, and a diner that seemed to be the only building with working lights. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, so I pulled into the station. A man in overalls shuffled out, his face pale and gaunt like he'd been carved out of wax. "You're lost," he said, not a question but a statement. "Just passing through," I replied, forcing a smile. "Can you fill her up?" He hesitated, then nodded. "You'd better leave soon. Night falls fast around here." While he pumped the gas, I decided to check out the diner. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee and something metallic, like pennies left in the sun. The waitress looked up from wiping the counter. She was young, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "You shouldn't stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People keep saying that," I replied. "What's the deal with this place?" She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was stuck at 3:33. "They don't like strangers." "Who's they?" She didn't answer, just slid a piece of pie in front of me. "On the house. Eat quick and go." The pie was cold, the crust hard as a brick. I didn't eat it. When I stepped outside, the gas station was empty. The man was gone, and my car sat alone in the lot with the pump still in the tank. That's when I heard it, a low hum, like the sound of power lines in the rain. The hum grew louder as a thick gray fog rolled in from the woods, swallowing the edges of the town. I ran to my car, yanked the pump out, and jumped in. But the engine wouldn't start. I cursed and turned the key again. Nothing. The fog pressed against the windows like it was alive, tendrils of mist curling around the glass. Then I saw them. Figures moved through the fog, their shapes indistinct but wrong. Too tall, their limbs bending at odd angles. They moved slowly, deliberately, like predators circling prey. A sharp knock on the driver's side window nearly stopped my heart. It was the waitress. "You can't stay here," she hissed. "Get out of the car and come with me." Now she led me through the fog, her hand gripping mine like a vice. The figures followed, their silhouettes flickering like a bad signal on a TV. We reached an old church at the edge of town. Its doors were heavy, the wood splintered and scarred as if something had tried to claw its way in. "Stay inside," she said, bolting the door behind us. The interior was dark, lit only by a few flickering candles. The walls were covered in carving symbols and words in a language I didn't recognize. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's the only safe spot," she replied. "They don't come in here. Who are they?" Her eyes darted to the windows. "They used to be us." The waitress, whose name I learned was Lily, explained that Gray Town wasn't always like this. "Years ago, something came here," she said, her voice barely audible. "A traveler like you. He brought something with him. A curse, a shadow. It seeped into the town, into the people. Some of us resisted, but most didn't. What happens if they catch you?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she pointed to the carvings on the walls. "This keeps them out. But it won't last forever." Outside, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. Lily handed me a piece of chalk and told me to draw the symbols on my car. "It's your only chance," she said. "But you'll have to go through them to get to it." The fog outside was thicker now, almost impenetrable. The figures were closer, their outlines sharper. Lily opened the church door a crack. "Run!" I sprinted into the fog, clutching the chalk like a lifeline. The figures moved faster, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they closed in. Reaching my car, I scrawled the symbols on the hood, the doors, the windows, anywhere I could. The chalk glowed faintly, a pale blue light that pushed the fog back just enough for me to see. I jumped in, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As I drove out of Gray Town, the fog thinned and the hum faded. The figures didn't follow me past the edge of the woods. When I reached the highway, I stopped at a rest area to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was about to burst. That's when I noticed the chalk symbols on my car were gone. But the hum? It was faint, distant, like a storm on the horizon. I don't know if I escaped or if Gray Town simply let me go. But I do know this: some wrong turns can't be undone. It started with a voicemail. "Hey, Detective Reeves. This is Sharon Fisher from Madison, New Hampshire. I don't know who else to call. My neighbors, the Carters, they've been gone for over a week. But the thing is, Detective, their house, it's still lit up every night, and I swear I saw someone in their window last night. The Carters don't have family, and no one's supposed to be there. Please, can you check it out?" Calls like this weren't unusual for a small-town detective like me, but something about Sharon's voice stuck with me. It wasn't panic. It was resignation, like she already knew no one was going to believe her. The Carter house sat on the edge of town, just shy of a thick forest that locals called Whispering Woods, the kind of place where kids dared each other to go after dark. I'd driven by the house dozens of times, always neat, always quiet. And when I pulled up that evening, it looked exactly the same. Porch light glowing, curtains drawn, a picture of suburban normalcy. But something was off. The first knock echoed through the still evening air. "Mr. Carter? Mrs. Carter? It's Detective Reeves. Just checking in." No response. I knocked again, harder this time, but the only sound was the faint creak of trees swaying in the wind. I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the door swinging open to reveal a pristine interior. Everything looked untouched: plates neatly stacked in the kitchen, a pair of shoes by the door, even a half-empty coffee mug on the living room table. "Mr. Carter? Mrs. Carter?" I called out again. Then I saw it. On the dining room wall was a message, scrawled in black marker: "Do not look in the mirrors." Ignoring the chill that crawled up my spine, I took a step closer to the message. It wasn't the neat, looping handwriting you'd expect from a note. It was jagged, desperate, like it had been written by someone in a hurry. The house had mirrors everywhere on the walls, in the hallways, even a tall antique one leaning against the staircase. I couldn't help but glance at my reflection. At first, it looked normal. Just me, staring back, a slight frown creasing my face. But then it moved. I didn't move, but my reflection did. Just a fraction of a second delay, a subtle tilt of the head, a blink too slow. It was enough to send me reeling backward. The sound came next, a rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, but heavier. It was coming from below. In the kitchen, I found the basement door slightly ajar. The thudding grew louder as I approached, each step vibrating through the floorboards. "Is someone down there?" I called, my voice firm. No answer. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement smelled damp, like earth and mildew, and the light barely pierced the thick shadows. Then I saw it, a tall, full-length mirror shoved against the far wall. Its surface was rippling, almost like water, and the reflection wasn't of the basement, but of another room entirely. In the reflection stood the Carters. They were facing me, but their faces were blank, smooth like porcelain dolls. And behind them, a dark figure loomed, its limbs impossibly long and crooked, its head tilted as though it was studying me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The rippling stopped, the mirror returning to a solid, lifeless surface. This wasn't something I could explain to the chief. Hell, I couldn't even explain it to myself. But I had to keep digging. Upstairs, I searched the Carters' bedroom. On the nightstand, I found a notebook filled with rambling entries. The last one caught my attention. The mirrors aren't ours anymore. They see us even when we don't look. Whatever's on the other side wants us, and it's coming soon. We're leaving, but if you find this, do not look in the mirrors. The house felt alive now, the walls groaning, shadows stretching longer than they should. I decided I'd seen enough. As I turned to leave, a whisper brushed against my ear. "Stay." It was soft, almost gentle, but it froze me in place. I glanced at the nearest mirror, an old oval one, hanging in the hallway, and saw my reflection again. This time, it wasn't mimicking me. It was smiling. Not a warm smile, but something hollow, predatory. The lights flickered, the air turning icy. In a blind panic, I bolted for the door, refusing to look at any of the mirrors lining the walls. When I burst outside, the night felt suffocating. The forest loomed darker than ever, and the house behind me seemed to hum with malevolent energy. I didn't file a report. What could I say? That the Carters were taken by something in their mirrors? That the house felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me? The Carters were never found. Their house sits empty now, boarded up, but still standing. Sometimes I pass by it on patrol, and I swear I see lights flicker inside, even though there's no power. And once, just once, I glanced in my rearview mirror as I drove past. There was someone in my back seat, just for a second. Now I avoid mirrors altogether. I don't keep them in my house, and I don't look in them when I'm out. Because whatever I saw that night, it saw me too. I never expected my life to be dissected into before and after Ask the Knock came at 10:43 p.m. sharp. 3 measured raps. Not frantic, not timid, just enough to cut through the thick hum. I opened the door to find her. A woman in her mid-30s, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face like seaweed on a shipwreck. Her eyes were what I noticed first, not just wide, but frantic, like someone trying to remember how to breathe. "Are you Caleb Price?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Depends who's asking," I replied. I wasn't trying to be coy. Old habits die hard when your job involves dodging angry EXEs and loan sharks. Her hands shook as she handed me a file. "I need you to look into something. Please. It's killing people." The file was thick, crammed with newspaper clippings, photos, and typed notes. The headline on the top page read, "The Glass Lake Incident. 5 missing, 1 survivor." I glanced at her, and the air between us felt electric. "What exactly am I looking at?" Her lip quivered as she whispered, "The most terrifying case you'll ever see." The woman, who introduced herself as Mallory Dean, explained that she was the lone survivor of the Glass Lake incident, a chilling unsolved mystery from 2 years ago. 5 campers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a blood-streaked campsite and a journal with cryptic entries about the whispers in the dark. "I shouldn't even be alive," Mallory said, her voice cracking. "I didn't escape. It let me go." I studied her as she spoke, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the nervous tics of someone who had seen too much. People lie to private investigators all the time, but Mallory's fear felt raw, unpolished. "What makes you think it's not over?" I asked. She pulled out a Polaroid from the file. It was a blurry image of what looked like a tall, skeletal figure standing in the tree line. The thing had no face, just an empty, pale oval, and its spindly arms stretched unnaturally long, as if reaching for the sky. "I've been seeing it everywhere," she said. "At the grocery store outside my apartment, even in my dreams. It's coming for me, Caleb. And it won't stop until I'm dead." I wanted to dismiss her as paranoid, another trauma victim with an overactive imagination. But something about the photo made my stomach churn. It felt wrong, like looking at a crime scene photo of a place you'd just been. Over the next week, I dove into Mallory's case. The Glass Lake file was a rabbit hole of madness. The journal left behind at the campsite described strange phenomena, sudden drops in temperature, voices calling out names, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. But it wasn't just the journal. Witness reports from locals claimed that Glass Lake had a history of vanishings dating back to the 1920s. Hikers would disappear, only to be found weeks later, miles away, babbling incoherently about the Hollow Man. As I pieced together the puzzle, my nights grew restless. I started hearing faint whispers in my own house, just at the edge of perception, like the sound of wind squeezing through cracks. Then came the dreams. Every night, I was back at the lake, walking through the woods as the shadows grew deeper, heavier. And always, just before waking, I'd see it, the faceless figure standing at the water's edge, its arms impossibly long, beckoning. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary haunting. A pattern emerged. Every 10 years, a cluster of disappearances, always near bodies of water, and always the survivors, when there were any, reported the same faceless figure. Mallory wasn't exaggerating about being stalked. I started seeing the figure too. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting shape in my peripheral vision, or a dark silhouette in a passing car's window. But as the days passed, it grew bolder. One night, I woke to find it standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, an oppressive void that seemed to swallow the very air in the room. Mallory and I decided to return to Glass Lake. If this thing wanted to finish what it started, we'd meet it on its turf. The lake was eerily calm that night, its surface like black glass reflecting the crescent moon. The whispers began the moment we stepped into the clearing, faint at first, then crescendoing into a deafening cacophony. And then it appeared. The figure emerged from the tree line, taller than I remembered, its faceless head tilting slightly, as if mocking us. Mallory screamed, and I raised the shotgun I'd brought, though deep down I knew it was useless. It didn't need to touch us to hurt us. The moment it stepped closer, my chest tightened and my vision blurred. Memories, some mine, some not, flooded my mind. a torrent of fear and despair that threatened to drown me. Mallory dropped to her knees, clutching her head and sobbing. "It's inside," she whispered. "It's in our minds. We barely escaped that night, stumbling out of the woods as dawn broke." Mallory disappeared 2 days later. The figure hasn't stopped following me. It lingers in every shadow, every reflection, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be shut. I don't know how this ends, but I do know one thing. The most terrifying cases aren't about what we can see, they're about what sees us. People always talk about haunted houses, cursed objects, or strange creatures lurking in the woods. But no one warns you about the things in the air, signals, whispers, and voices that shouldn't be there. It started with static. As a freelance radio technician, I'd been hired to repair an old broadcasting tower just outside of Pine Hill, a small town tucked deep in the mountains of Vermont. The locals called it the Dead Air Tower. It had been abandoned for decades, but a new company had bought the property, hoping to resurrect its use. "It's been quiet for years," the man who hired me said over the phone. "But the locals swear it still talks." I didn't think much of it. Superstition was part of small-town charm, after all. But when I arrived at the tower, I understood why people didn't come near it. The structure loomed against the gray sky, rusted and jagged, like a scar in the earth. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, and the wind carried an odd hum, just faint enough to make you question whether you were hearing it at all. The control shack at the base of the tower was a wreck. Dust-coated equipment sat in disarray, wires spilling onto the floor like the guts of some mechanical beast. As I worked to reconnect the system, the hum in the air seemed to grow louder. I brushed it off as interference from the old equipment. Then the signal came through. At first, it was just static, the kind you'd expect from an untuned radio. But buried beneath it was something else. A voice. "Hello." It was faint, almost drowned out by the crackling static, but unmistakable. I leaned closer to the console, adjusting the frequency. "Who's there?" I asked, half expecting it to be a prank from a local. The static shifted, and the voice returned, clearer this time. "Help." "Me." I checked the logs. The tower hadn't broadcast anything in over 30 years, and there were no active connections to the equipment. The voice couldn't be coming from the tower itself, at least, not by any rational explanation. Then I found the journal. It was shoved under a stack of manuals, the leather cover cracked and faded. Inside were notes from the last maintenance crew to work on the tower in 1992. October 3rd. Heard voices in the static today. Thompson says it's just interference, but it sounded like a woman crying October 8th. The hum is louder now. It feels like it's inside my head. I can't sleep. October 15th. Thompson's gone. His car is still here, but he's just gone. I'm leaving tomorrow. To whoever reads this, don't listen to the signal. There were no more entries. By the time the sun began to set, the air around the tower felt electric, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I decided to finish the job quickly and leave. But as I climbed the tower to inspect the antenna, the hum grew into a low drone, vibrating through the metal structure. And then the voices started again. Not one voice, but many. Dozens. They overlapped, speaking in whispers and shouts, some crying, others laughing. I froze halfway up the tower, clutching the cold metal ladder. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself. But the voices didn't care. From the height of the tower, I could see the entire valley bathed in the last light of the day. The town of Pine Hill was barely a smudge in the distance. But then I saw it something moving in the woods below. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow grew larger, stretching unnaturally as it approached the base of the tower. The voices in the air grew frantic, their tones shifting from pleading to panicked. "Don't let it in," one voice begged. "Run," another screamed. The shadow stopped at the base of the tower. It was formless, shifting and writhing like smoke, but with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. And then it began to climb. I scrambled down the tower as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow followed, moving with an impossible fluidity. It didn't climb like a person. It seeped through the gaps in the metal, always just a few steps behind me. When I reached the bottom, I sprinted for the control shack, slamming the door behind me. The equipment inside crackled to life, the static now deafening. The voices screamed in unison, words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my chest. The shadow pressed against the windows, darkening the room. I grabbed the journal, flipping through it desperately for answers. Shut it down, one page read in bold, shaky letters. Kill the signal. I lunged for the main console, yanking wires and flipping switches. The hum in the air grew higher, almost a shriek, as if the tower itself was alive and fighting me. Finally, I found the main power switch and pulled it. The room fell silent. The shadow vanished, the air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. When I returned to town, no one believed me. They said the tower had always been like that, broken, quiet, harmless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only delayed something inevitable. A week later, I got a call from the company that hired me. They wanted me to go back and finish the repairs. I refused. And then I heard the faint hum coming through my phone line. The bridge had been closed for years, but every so often, people still crossed it. Not because they needed to, but because they didn't know the stories. Back in the 70s, Birchwood Bridge was the fastest route between two small towns in Maine, Mapleton and Dairy Creek. Locals knew it as the Toll Bridge because, for decades, a man named Earl Motson sat in a little wooden booth halfway across, collecting change from drivers. Earl wasn't remarkable, just another weathered face in a town full of them. But one night in 1979, Earl disappeared. His booth was found abandoned, the drawer full of quarters untouched. The only clue was a single bloody handprint smeared across the inside of the booth window. After that, strange things started happening. Drivers who crossed the bridge at night reported hearing whispers, footsteps, even knocking on their car windows. The rumors grew so bad that the county shut the bridge down in 1982. Now, 40 years later, Birchwood Bridge was just a decaying relic, a shortcut no one dared take. Except for me. It was a stupid decision, but I was running late for a family gathering in Mapleton, and I couldn't stomach the thought of taking the long route. Birchwood Bridge was still technically standing, and I figured I could save myself a good 20 minutes. The sun was setting as I approached the barricades. They were easy enough to move just a couple of rusted metal sawhorses, and the road leading up to the bridge was cracked but drivable. When I reached the bridge itself, my headlights illuminated the wooden toll booth. It was still standing, though it leaned precariously to one side. The glass window was filthy, streaked with grime and something darker that might have been rust or blood. I drove past it slowly, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I told myself it was just the cold October air, but deep down I knew better. Halfway across the bridge, my car stalled. One moment, the engine was purring. The next, it sputtered and died, leaving me in silence. I turned the key, but the engine wouldn't catch. Great, I muttered, reaching for my phone. As I scrolled through my contacts, a loud knock echoed through the car. I froze, my phone slipping from my hand. Slowly, I turned to look out the driver's side window. There was no one there. Another knock came, this time from the passenger side. Heart pounding, I glanced at the toll booth in my rearview mirror. Its window was no longer streaked with grime. It was clear, and through it, I could see a shadowy figure sitting inside. The figure stood and began walking toward my car. Its gait was slow, deliberate, and as it moved, I could hear the clink of coins like someone jangling loose change in their pocket. I locked the doors and grabbed my phone, fumbling to call for help. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. A voice whispered from behind me, soft and raspy, "Where's your toll?" I screamed, spinning around to see the back seat. It was empty. The whispers came again, louder this time, echoing in my ears. The toll. The toll. You have to pay the toll. Desperate, I shoved open the car door and stumbled out onto the bridge. The night was deathly quiet, except for the sound of coins hitting the ground. I turned toward the toll booth and saw him. Earl Matson, or what was left of him. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his uniform was soaked with dark stains that shimmered under the moonlight. He held out a hand, palm up, as if expecting payment. "Take it," I said, digging into my pocket and tossing a handful of change onto the bridge. The coins skittered across the asphalt, but Earl didn't move. "That's not enough," he rasped. "What do you want?" I yelled. Earl's head tilted to one side, his sunken eyes locking onto mine. "Your life," he whispered. I bolted for the end of the bridge, my footsteps echoing loudly against the rotting planks. Behind me, the sound of jangling coins grew louder, faster, as if Earl was right on my heels. "Pay the toll," he bellowed, his voice no longer a whisper, but a thunderous roar. The far end of the bridge felt impossibly far away, the darkness ahead seeming to stretch forever. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally reached the barricades at the other side, I didn't slow down. I vaulted over them and sprinted into the woods, the sound of Earl's pursuit fading into the distance. I made it to my family's house in Mapleton, shaking and breathless. I didn't tell them what had happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of coins clinking outside my window. The whispers came next, soft and insistent. "You didn't pay. You didn't pay." I've been hearing them ever since. It's been 3 years since I crossed Birchwood Bridge. I moved out of state, changed my number, even stopped carrying cash. But no matter where I go, the whispers follow. If you ever find yourself near Pine Hill, do yourself a favor. Stay away from Birchwood Bridge, because Earl Matson is still there, waiting for his toll. And if you don't pay, he'll take more than just your money. My Uncle Arthur always warned me about the woods near his cabin in northern Wisconsin. "There's something wrong with those trees," he'd say, sipping his whiskey and staring into the fire. "And if you ever see a man in a green suit, don't talk to him. Just run." It sounded like drunken rambling when I was a kid, the kind of story meant to scare me into staying close to the house. But as I got older, I started to notice how serious Arthur looked whenever he mentioned it. "Who is he?" I asked once. Arthur didn't answer right away. He just shook his head and muttered, "He's nobody you want to meet." I didn't believe him. Not until the night I saw the man myself. It was late September, and I'd come to Arthur's cabin to help him pack up his things. He was moving to Florida to escape the brutal Midwest winters, and the cabin had been sold to some developer who planned to turn the property into a resort. The woods were quiet that evening, the air heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. As I carried a box to my car, I saw him standing just at the edge of the tree line. The man in the green suit. He looked out of place, like he'd stepped out of a 1950 seconds catalog. His suit was immaculate, the fabric shimmering faintly in the fading light. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, tilted just enough to cast a shadow over his face. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth, almost melodic, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled a slow, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You should leave," he said finally. "Before the forest decides to keep you." I told Arthur about the man that night. His reaction was immediate and visceral. "You talked to him?" He snapped, his face pale. "I didn't have much of a choice," I said. "He was just standing there." Arthur grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "Did he ask you for anything? Did you give him anything?" "No," I said, shaken. "He just told me to leave." Arthur let out a shaky breath and muttered a curse under his breath. "You need to listen to him. Pack your things and go." "Tonight? Why? Who is he?" Arthur's eyes darted to the window as if expecting the man to appear there. "He's not a man. Not really. And if he's shown himself to you, it's already too late. I didn't leave." I wish I had. The next morning, the woods felt different. The air was colder, the trees darker, their branches twisting unnaturally against the sky. As I walked to the car to load another box, I noticed something odd: footprints. They weren't mine, and they didn't belong to Arthur either. They were too large, the edges oddly sharp, like claws had pressed into the soil. The tracks led from the edge of the woods to the cabin and then back again, circling the house. Arthur refused to go outside. He stayed in his chair by the fireplace, a shotgun resting across his lap. "He's watching us," he muttered. That night, I woke to the sound of someone knocking on the cabin door. "Don't answer it," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling. The knocking continued, louder this time, more insistent. I crept to the window and peered out, my heart pounding in my chest. There he was, the man in the green suit, standing on the porch with that same unsettling smile. "Let me in," he called, his voice sing-song. "It's awfully cold out here." Arthur raised the shotgun, aiming it at the door. "You can't shoot him," I whispered. "I know," Arthur said grimly, "but I can try." The knocking stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire cabin. "I'm not going anywhere," the man's voice called. "And you'll have to pay the toll sooner or later." Arthur whispered something under his breath, words I didn't understand. The hum grew louder, the walls of the cabin trembling as if the forest itself was alive and angry. "What does he want?" I asked, panic rising. Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he stood and opened the door. The man in the green suit stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a shadow swallowing the light. "Oh, Arthur," he said, his smile widening. "It's been a long time." Arthur's hands shook as he placed the shotgun on the floor. "Take me," he said. "Just leave him out of it." The man in the green suit tilted his head, considering the offer. "A noble gesture," he said. "But the forest doesn't work that way." He turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "You've been marked, my boy. And once the forest marks you, there's no escaping it." I backed away, my heart racing. "I didn't do anything. You came here," the man said simply. "And that's enough." I don't remember much about what happened next. There was a blinding light, a deafening roar, and then silence. When I woke up, The cabin was gone. So was Arthur. The clearing where the house had stood was overgrown, the trees closing in as if trying to erase any trace of its existence. I ran to my car and didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. That was 10 years ago. I've never been back to those woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a knock at my door. And when I look outside, I see him. The man in the green suit, waiting with that same smile. When I took the job at Pine Hill Psychiatric Hospital, I thought it was a step forward in my career. It was an old place, built in the late 1800s, perched on a lonely hill surrounded by dense forest. The locals called it the Quiet House, though I'd soon learn that name was misleading. My position was straightforward: night orderly. Keep an eye on the patients, report any incidents, and make sure everything was locked up tight. The hospital's staff was small, just a skeleton crew at night, and I mostly worked alone. It wasn't until my second week that I noticed something strange about the patient roster. Room 6C was listed, but it had no name or medical record attached. When I asked Dr. Fenton, the hospital director, about it, he gave me a curt response. "Don't worry about room 6C, he said. It's not your concern, but of course, that only made me more curious. Room 6C was at the end of the south wing, far from the other patient rooms. The corridor leading to it was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling shadows. The door to 6C was different from the others, thicker, reinforced, with a heavy padlock. One night, as I made my rounds, I thought I heard something from behind the door. A faint rustling, like someone moving around. I stopped and pressed my ear to the cold metal. "Hello," I called softly. There was no response. I reported the noise to Dr. Fenton the next morning, but he dismissed it with an irritated wave of his hand. "You're imagining things," he said. Still, the sound haunted me. It was a stormy night when I finally saw her. I was walking past 6C when I caught movement from the small, reinforced window in the door. A pale face, wide eyes, staring out at me. I froze, the flashlight in my hand trembling. She mouthed something, her lips forming silent words I couldn't understand. I ran to the security desk and grabbed the keyring, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was doing, if this was against protocol, or if I was putting myself in danger, but I couldn't leave her locked in there. When I unlocked the door, the room was empty. I knew I couldn't let this go. The next day, I snuck into Dr. Fenton's office and searched through the files. Most of them were standard medical records, but at the bottom of a locked drawer, I found an old yellowed folder labeled Patient 6C. The first page was a photograph, a black and white image of a young woman with hollow eyes and a vacant expression. The name on the file read Margaret Hayes. She'd been admitted in 1953 after a psychotic break. The notes were sparse, but there was one detail that chilled me. Margaret claimed to hear voices coming from the walls, whispering secrets meant only for her. The file ended abruptly, with no discharge date or cause of death. After that, the hospital didn't feel the same. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. And then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind or the creak of the old building. But the voices were distinct, layered, speaking in low tones just beyond comprehension. They followed me, growing louder as I approached 6C. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I burst into the room, demanding answers from the empty walls. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What do you want?" The whispers stopped, and then, for the first time, I heard a single voice, clear and sharp. You let her out. Margaret wasn't a patient anymore. She was something else, something that had been trapped in that room for decades. And now, thanks to me, she was free. I started seeing her everywhere. At the end of the hallway, reflected in the windows, standing silently in the corner of my bedroom at night. Dr. Fenton refused to acknowledge it. "You're imagining things," he said again, but his face betrayed him. He knew. One night, as the whispers filled my apartment, I heard her voice. "They locked me away," she said. "But you opened the door." I tried to quit, but Pine Hill wouldn't let me go. Every time I packed my things, something stopped me: a sudden illness, a car that wouldn't start, an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, holding me in its grasp. Margaret's presence grew stronger, her visits more frequent. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words were laced with venom. "They thought they could bury me," she said one night, her face inches from mine. "But you've brought me back." I realized then that she wasn't haunting me. She was using me. The truth hit me like a freight train. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a forgotten patient. She was a sacrifice, sealed away to keep whatever darkness lingered in Pine Hill from spreading. And now I'd undone it all. The hospital began to change. The walls pulsed as if alive, the lights dimmed to a sickly green, and the whispers turned into screams. Dr. Fenton disappeared, along with most of the staff. Those of us who remained were trapped, wandering the endless hallways as the hospital twisted and shifted around us. Margaret had become the heart of it all, her laughter echoing through the chaos. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Months? Time doesn't work the same way anymore. Sometimes I hear voices from outside: police officers, reporters, people trying to understand what happened at Pine Hill. But they never find the building. It's gone, swallowed by the forest, leaving no trace except for the whispers that follow anyone who comes too close. If you ever find yourself near Pine Hill and you hear someone calling your name, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't open the door to room 6C.